Most people who worked on that production remember the rehearsal as a difficult day. Almost none of them remember what actually ended it. It was the mid-1960s, on a soundstage rented for rehearsals ahead of a major television special, one of the large, ambitious variety broadcasts that defined the era, the kind that brought together singers, dancers, comedians, and orchestras under one roof for a single night of live television. The soundstage itself was utilitarian, nothing like the glamorous sets audiences would see once cameras rolled. Bare walls, taped marks on the floor, folding chairs pushed against the edges of the room, and a long table where producers and directors sat, watching, taking notes, occasionally murmuring to one another in voices just low enough not to carry. Ann-Margret was there to rehearse a number that mattered more than most people realized. It was not simply another performance in a long broadcast. It was, for her, a chance to be seen differently, not as the energetic film star audiences already knew, but as a performer capable of carrying a serious, demanding piece in front of millions of people, live, with no opportunity to redo it. And somewhere in the middle of that rehearsal, something in the room shifted, quietly, the way these things often do, without anyone announcing it. To understand why that shift mattered, it helps to understand what these television specials actually were, and what they meant for performers like Ann-Margret. By the mid-1960s, network television had become one of the most powerful forces in entertainment, bigger in terms of audience than almost anything else available to a performer. A single broadcast could reach more people in one evening than a film might reach in months of theatrical release. For producers, that scale came with enormous pressure. Every number, every transition, every second of a broadcast like this was planned, timed, and rehearsed obsessively, because there would be no second chance once the cameras went live. Rehearsal rooms for these specials were, as a result, intensely focused environments, full of people whose job was to notice problems before they became visible to an audience. Choreographers watched for anything out of step. Music directors listened for anything out of time. And producers, sitting at that long table with their notes, watched everything, forming quiet judgments about who could be trusted with the moments that mattered most. These judgments were rarely spoken aloud. They did not need to be. A rehearsal room has its own way of communicating doubt. A pause that lasts a beat too long. A glance exchanged between two people at the producer's table. A note written down and underlined rather than said out loud. Performers learn to read these signals because their entire careers could shift based on what those signals meant. For Ann-Margret, this particular rehearsal carried weight beyond the usual pressure of live television. She had been cast in a number that was, by design, different from the energetic, up-tempo performances most associated with her at the time. It called for restraint, for a kind of stillness and control that did not rely on movement or spectacle to hold an audience. It was, in many ways, a test, not officially, not on paper, but in the unspoken way these things were tested in rooms like this. Could she carry a moment that depended on subtlety rather than energy? Could the producers trust her with something this important? The early part of the rehearsal had not gone smoothly. Not because anything had gone dramatically wrong. There was no single mistake anyone could point to, but because something in the run-through had not yet found its shape. The timing felt slightly tentative. The stillness the number required kept tipping, almost imperceptibly, into hesitation instead of control. To anyone watching closely, the difference was small. But in a rehearsal room built around noticing small differences, small was enough. Ann-Margret could feel it, the particular quality of silence from the producer's table after a run-through. The kind of silence that wasn't quite criticism, but wasn't approval either. She had been in enough rooms like this to recognize what it meant. The room was beginning to wonder whether she was the right choice for this moment. No one said so. No one needed to. Sammy Davis Jr. was not scheduled to be in that rehearsal room that afternoon. By the mid-1960s, Sammy Davis Jr. was one of the most respected all-around performers in American entertainment. A singer, dancer, actor, and entertainer whose work ethic was spoken about with something close to reverence within the industry. He had spent decades earning that reputation, often under circumstances far more difficult than most of his peers ever faced, and he had developed, as a result, an unusually sharp sense for two things: genuine talent and the specific kind of doubt that could quietly end a performer's opportunity before it had even fully begun. He had come to the soundstage that day for an entirely different reason: to go over staging for his own segment of the broadcast in a different part of the building. His path to that rehearsal had nothing to do with Ann-Margret's. But soundstages in those days were large, interconnected spaces, and as he made his way toward his own rehearsal area, he passed close enough to hear the tail end of a run-through, and close enough to see, just briefly, the producer's table, the notes being written, the particular stillness of people deciding something without saying it. He did not need to see the whole rehearsal to understand what was happening. He had been on the other side of that table's silence more times than he could count earlier in his own career, and he recognized the shape of it instantly. He stopped walking. What happened next was small enough that, to most people in that room, it barely registered as an event at all. Sammy Davis Jr. did not walk to the producer's table. He did not interrupt the rehearsal, or make any kind of formal statement, or draw attention to himself in any way that would have made the moment feel staged. Instead, he simply moved toward the edge of the rehearsal space, close enough to be visible, but not close enough to seem like part of the production's decision-making, and stayed there, watching the next run-through. For Ann-Margret, stepping back into position for another take, the presence of someone like Sammy Davis Jr. standing quietly at the edge of the room was impossible not to notice. But what mattered was not simply that he was there. It was the way he was there. Not as an observer waiting to see if she would fail, and not as someone offering performative encouragement, but with the same quality of attention she had felt from the producer's table, except turned in the opposite direction. Where their silence had carried doubt, his stillness carried something else: attention without judgment, the kind of watching that comes from someone who already knows what they're looking for and is simply waiting to see it. The run-through began again, and something in the room changed. Not because of anything Sammy Davis Jr. said, because at that point he had said nothing at all. It changed because, for the first time that afternoon, Ann-Margret was not performing toward a room that had already started to doubt her. She was performing toward someone who, without a word, had made clear that he expected her to succeed. The stillness the number required, the control that had been tipping into hesitation, settled almost immediately into something steadier. Not because the choreography changed, not because anything about the number itself was different, simply because the quality of attention in the room had shifted, and she had felt it shift, and her performance had shifted with it. When the run-through ended, The silence from the producer's table was different. It was not effusive. No one applauded. There was no dramatic announcement that the doubts of a few minutes earlier had been resolved. But the quality of the silence had changed. The particular weight of a room that had seen what it needed to see, rather than a room still waiting to decide. A few notes were written down. A producer murmured something to the person beside him. The rehearsal moved on to the next number, the way rehearsals always did, without ceremony. Sammy Davis Jr., for his part, did not stay to be thanked. By the time Ann-Margret had a moment to look toward the edge of the room, he was already gone, back to his own rehearsal, in his own part of the building, exactly where he had been scheduled to be all along. Later that day, one of the dancers mentioned, almost in passing, that Sammy Davis Jr. had been watching for a few minutes earlier. Ann-Margret had already known. She did not need to be told. But hearing it confirmed that what she had felt was real, that someone had genuinely been there, watching, on her side, without being asked, settled something that the rehearsal itself had not quite settled. She never had a conversation with him about it. There was no formal exchange of thanks, no moment where either of them acknowledged out loud what had happened. In the world of television rehearsals, where dozens of people move through dozens of rooms every day, it was the kind of moment that could easily have been forgotten entirely by everyone except the one person it had been for. In the years that followed, Ann-Margret and Sammy Davis Jr. would cross paths many times, in television specials, in Las Vegas showrooms, in the small, interconnected world of performers who worked the same stages and studios for decades. Their friendship, such as it was, never depended on grand gestures. It was built, in part, on moments like this one, quiet, unannounced, and never spoken of afterward. For everyone else who had been in that rehearsal room that day, the afternoon was remembered, if at all, as simply a rehearsal that had started roughly and ended fine. The kind of day that happens constantly in television production, forgotten by the time the broadcast aired. No memo described what had happened. No interview ever mentioned it. The producers who had sat at that table, writing their quiet notes, likely never connected the shift in the room to anything beyond the natural ebb and flow of a long rehearsal day. But for Ann-Margret, that afternoon remained one of the clearest examples of something she would encounter again and again throughout her career. The difference between a room that doubts you and a room that doesn't, and how much of a performance lives in that difference, even when nothing about the performance itself has changed. What Sammy Davis Jr. had given her that day was not advice and not a defense delivered in words. It was simply his attention, offered without condition, asked for by no one, and withdrawn just as quietly once it was no longer needed. Most people who worked on that production remember the rehearsal as a difficult day. Almost none of them remember what actually ended it. But Ann-Margret did, not as a story she told often, and not as something she ever needed anyone else to understand, just as a memory of a room that had, for a few minutes, decided something about her without saying a word, and of the one person in it who had quietly decided something different.